This woman's husband wrote her a brutal note, so she got revenge. When Laura's husband left her in a completely unexpected and heartbreaking way, she had some big news of her own to share. Keep listening to find out exactly how Laura got her payback. Laura always assumed her marriage was a happy one, but one day this idea completely evaporated when Laura came home to find a note written for her by her husband Jack. Jack thought he'd done the right thing by leaving Laura for her sister, but he had no idea what had happened while he was writing the note. Laura threw him a massive curveball, but what was the revenge that changed both their lives? While Laura was reading the letter from her husband, she was finding it really hard to keep her composure. All she kept thinking to herself was, well, that's the end of a 7-year marriage. She was really struggling with the shock of reading the words. To make things worse, Jack began the letter addressed to his dear wife by saying that he was writing the letter to tell her he was leaving her forever. The finality of this statement and the bluntness of it seemed incredibly drastic and wildly out of left field. Laura had absolutely no idea that this was how Jack had been feeling. Just before she'd gone home, Laura was in a completely amazing mood because she had just gotten some wonderful news and couldn't wait to share it with her husband. However, she arrived home to find the surprising and shocking confession that her husband was leaving her for her own sister. Jack's letter claimed that he had been a good man and husband to Laura for the full 7 years of their marriage, but that he had nothing to show for it. He also wrote in the letter that the previous 2 weeks had been awful for him and that Laura's boss had just called to say that she'd quit her job and that was the last straw for Jack. Jack said in the letter that a week before, Laura came home and didn't notice that Jack had a new haircut and was wearing a new pair of silk boxers. He'd complained that Laura ate her dinner in 2 minutes and went straight to bed after watching her soap operas. He said that Laura doesn't tell him she loves him anymore and doesn't want anything that connects them as a married couple. Jack ended the letter by accusing Laura of either cheating on him or not loving him anymore, but claimed that it didn't matter which because he was gone. He then signed the letter "Your ex-husband" and added a postscript that told Laura not to try to find him because her sister and he were moving to West Virginia together. Up to this point, Laura had been having a good day, but the letter of betrayal by her husband was deeply hurtful. Not only because her husband of 7 years was leaving her, but because he was leaving her for her sister. The letter from Jack to Laura came at the best time ever. If Jack had waited one more day to write the letter, then Laura wouldn't have found out what Jack's real feelings were and that he was cheating on her with her sister. The amazing news that Laura had just gotten? She'd won the lottery. So even though she was sad about the letter she just got from her husband and knew that she was losing her husband, she was also still happy that she was one of the very few who'd won big on the lottery. Laura and Jack were both in college when they first met. However, they didn't have a special connection when they first met each other, and even though they were studying for exams together and spending a lot of time in the library, that would become valuable members of each other's lives in the future. Jack ended up dropping out of college and then started working as a bartender, and neither Laura nor Jack knew that their love stories wouldn't last forever. When they met, they were from totally opposite walks of life. Laura came from a wealthy family and was studying hard in college. Jack, on the other hand, had a part-time job as a bartender and didn't really have any other ambitions. Laura's parents were dead set against their daughter marrying Jack. From the very beginning of their relationship, Laura's parents disapproved of her and Jack's relationship because they wanted Laura to have more than Jack was able to provide her with. But by then it was too late because Laura was deeply in love with Jack and didn't care about what her parents thought. Jack was convinced that his love for Laura was enough because she was stubborn and wouldn't easily let Jack go. Laura's parents didn't like Jack and Laura's relationship, and they totally knew best, but when our parents put too much pressure on us, we often push back against them even more. So, a totally in love Laura decided to move in with her partner and start living together. However, 7 years down the line, her one regret was that she didn't listen to her parents all those years ago. Just after Laura graduated from college, she moved into Jack's one-bedroom apartment with him. Jack was totally used to the apartment, but in reality, the whole place was small and grimy. The paint on the walls was old and jaded, the heater never worked, and the level of maintenance was pretty poor. However, Laura held out hope that made her think it would all get better. She also had her enthusiasm for everything because she'd never lived with her boyfriend before, so it was all a new adventure for her. It was a fresh and exciting experience, and it was made better by the love she had for Jack. Laura felt she deserved for Jack to discuss his feelings with her in person, but it was too late for that now. Laura still wanted to tell Jack her good news, that she'd won the lottery, but now she wanted to tell him so he knew what a massive mistake he'd made. During all their years struggling financially, Laura always tried and hoped that she might get lucky with the lottery. This story could have been a love story about two people who overcame difficulties in order to stay together, make their marriage work, and live happily ever after. But this isn't one of those stories, and over time, Jack and Laura's marriage started to crumble. Their relationship was beautiful while it lasted, but it had to come to an end, just like most beautiful things do. There's only so much that compatibility and personal change people can go through together as they age and experience life. Sometimes it's the everyday, mundane aspects of the relationship that bring it to an end. Before she got her letter from Jack, Jack meant the world to Laura. All she ever wanted was just to be with him, even if he couldn't provide her with a type of life that she grew up with and was used to. Ever since getting together, the couple had to be safe and tight with money. That's when Laura agreed to help Jack financially by getting a job as a waitress in a restaurant near their apartment. Laura started getting good tips, and that really helped them to live comfortably. But after a few years, Laura started to get a bit suspicious. Laura just wanted to spend all her time with Jack, so she often went up to visit him at the bar where he was working. She mainly did this to spend some extra time with him, but after a while she started to come across clues that Jack might be cheating on her. People who were at the bar started to look at her strangely, but Laura didn't want to believe her own suspicions. She shook off the feeling of uncertainty and visited Jack much less often while he was at work. She was still happy and in love with Jack, but later on, she learned that the feeling of uncertainty she had back then wasn't just a feeling. All this time, Laura kept chancing it and buying lottery tickets, even though she consistently lost. Then eventually, Laura won a lottery draw. She couldn't believe it and was unbelievably happy and excited about the whole thing. The first thing she did was book 2 tickets to Hawaii so that she and Jack could celebrate her win while they were there. However, once she saw the letter Jack had written to her, she didn't want to go on a holiday with Jack. Not only that, she wanted to make him sure that he wouldn't get 1 single cent of her lottery money, and she didn't want him back either. Even though she was upset by her husband's letter, Laura still felt really happy about winning the lottery and was wondering what she would do with the money. She was wondering if she should travel the world, buy a big house, a fancy car, or a yacht. The whole thing felt really overwhelming and she had a lot to think about at the moment. But she knew the first thing she wanted to do was to reply to Jack. She started the letter, "Dear ex-husband," and told him how getting his letter really made her day. She said that even though they were together for 7 years, he'd been far from a good man to her. She then said that her favorite meal he cooked for her must have been for her sister, especially since she stopped eating pork before they met. However, she wasn't finished yet. Laura said that when she saw Jack in his new boxers and turned away, it was because she'd seen a price tag for them for $49.99 and hoped that it was all just a coincidence that her sister had borrowed $50 from her that morning. But despite that, Laura still loved him and wanted to work on things. So it looks like all the suspicions she had about Jack cheating on her were real, even though she didn't want to believe him. But after reading the letter, Laura realized the reality of the situation. Just so Jack could be certain, Laura told him that the only reason she'd quit her job that day was that she won $15 million in the lottery, and she thought spending time with him was more important than sitting at a desk at work all day. However, once she read Jack's letter, everything changed. She told him that everything happens for a reason, and she sure hoped that he got the life of fulfillment that he always craved. Laura was really struggling with her feelings of rejection and betrayal and knew she had to cope with these feelings before she could contemplate how she should spend her lottery money. Laura knew she had to figure out how much Jack would get because he was her husband, so she called up her lawyer and told him everything, including the letter she'd just gotten from Jack. Her lawyer was super helpful and told her how the law works. Her lawyer told her that the letter Jack wrote made it certain that he wouldn't get any of her lottery winnings. She then included in her letter that she wasn't sure if she'd ever told Jack or not, but that his sister Carla was actually born Carl and hoped that wouldn't be a problem for him. What a way to tell someone that. We're not sure if that's actually true or not, but it's still a pretty funny way to finish a letter. The possibility of winning the lottery was always a massive thrill for Laura, and even though she figured she'd never win it, she kept on trying. Then, once everything ended up the way it did between herself and Jack, she was even luckier. What an eventful day for Laura. She won $15 million in the lottery and then found out her husband had an eventful day too. He was leaving his wife for her very own sister. Laura's reaction to Jack's news that he was leaving her for her sister is actually the last thing he ever would have thought would happen, and it was literally the best and ultimate revenge that Laura would ever take. Especially since Laura told Jack that he was fleeing with her sister who was, once upon a time, her brother. But with her tickets to Hawaii already booked and paid for, Laura knew she had to go on vacation anyway, and she could do whatever she wanted with her freedom. Even though Laura had suspicions that Jack was cheating on her, she always loved him. It was also because of this love that she booked them both tickets to Hawaii with her lottery winnings. Things weren't quite working out the way Laura had planned because it was now crystal clear that Jack had been unfaithful to her and had decided to leave her behind. She knew that now was her chance to embrace her freedom and move on to a new life. This day was a pretty interesting one for Laura, and despite her mixed feelings about Jack and Carla, she was still happy, knowing that her suspicions had been proven right and she had a chance to change her life now. While she was sitting in the taxi on the way to the airport, she was really happy, knowing that her now ex-husband had gotten his comeuppance and that she was now free to go and enjoy her Hawaiian trip on her own terms.